The sound came first, a low, grinding hum echoing across the Loire estuary, bouncing off walls of poured concrete 30 feet thick. Inside the vast U-boat pens of Saint-Nazaire, diesel fumes hung like fog above the steel monsters tethered to their berths. Each pen door weighed as much as a locomotive. Each roof slab, dense with rebar and granite aggregate, was built to defy the sky itself. The German Kriegsmarine called them unzerstörbar, indestructible. But that illusion would not last. From the shadows of war rooms in London and Washington, Allied engineers pored over reconnaissance photos, measuring the impossible. Roofs 5 meters thick, spanning bunkers like cathedrals. How do you break a fortress that even 5,000-pound bombs bounce off like hailstones? The answer would come in a weapon so radical that even pilots doubted its existence. The Tallboy and later the Grand Slam, deep penetration earthquake bombs, designed not to pierce steel but to shake the world beneath it. Yet before these weapons ever roared through the skies, men on both sides lived in the underbelly of this war of engineering. Sailors refueling submarines by lantern light, French civilians carting gravel for bunker roofs, RAF crews in Lincolnshire counting seconds between engine coughs and blackout flares. What did it feel like to stand beneath the shadow of a structure designed never to fall, and then watch it tremble? What did the concrete giants symbolize? Invincibility or desperation? A Red Cross inspection report dated April 1944 noted civilian displacement near Lorient, where over 30,000 tons of concrete had already sealed the coastline. Each block carried not just steel and cement, but a nation's conviction that the Atlantic Wall would hold. Didn't. Tonight, we go inside those pens, through the echoes of machinery, into the blueprints of destruction, to uncover how Allied persistence, raw physics, and human ingenuity cracked what the Reich believed unbreakable. The winter air along the Loire River tasted of lime dust and diesel. In February 1941, as cranes groaned above the estuary at Saint-Nazaire, German engineers from Organization Todt paced across scaffolding that swayed with each Atlantic gust. Beneath them, thousands of tons of freshly poured concrete hardened in the chill, the birth of the first U-boat pen, a fortress meant to outlive the war itself. They worked day and night, floodlights glaring through the fog, the sound of trowels and mixers echoing like artillery. Every hour, cement barges arrived from Bordeaux, carrying aggregate and slag. A total of 4,500 cubic meters poured per week, according to the site ledger. On paper, it was an engineering marvel. In reality, it was a race against fear. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat war against Britain had entered its decisive phase. Admiral Karl Donit's wolf packs were ravaging Atlantic convoys. Yet every time they returned to French ports, Allied bombers stalked the skies above. Germany needed shelters so massive, so thick, that no explosive could touch them. The pens would serve as both repair docks and monuments to German resolve, what one engineer called cathedrals of the Reich beneath the tide. At ground level, the scene was less divine. Laborers, French, Dutch, and Spanish prisoners, mixed cement beside uniformed German specialists. Wages were noted in ration cards, not marks. The La Rochelle ICRC inspection log of October 1943 would later report increasing fatigue and ration deficits averaging 400 calories per man per day. But in early 1941, the optimism was industrial, mechanical, almost fevered. The roof sections rose in layers, each 1-meter slab reinforced by steel bars the thickness of a man's wrist. When a worker accidentally dropped a wrench from the top girder, it struck the floor with a sound like cannon fire, and no one dared speak for a moment. The site foreman, Otto Lammers, wrote to his wife in Hamburg that the walls swallow noise like fog. Every movement was measured, every calculation recorded. The pens at Saint-Nazaire would eventually cover over 40,000 square meters, divided into 14 submarine berths. Each berth could house a Type 7 or Type 9 U-boat, serviced by crews beneath the roof that, when finished, would be over 3.5 meters thick. Even the Allies, studying grainy aerial photos months later, mistook the growing complex for an entire city block of warehouses. But as the structure rose, so did the tension. Luftwaffe officers inspected the progress and warned of inevitable British retaliation. The first air raid sirens blared in March 1941. No hits recorded, but the vibration of nearby impacts caused hairline fractures in the wet concrete. That night, the workers slept inside the very pens they were building, listening to their own walls absorb the shock. What did those men feel, pride or dread, as they realized they were sealing themselves inside what would become one of the most targeted coordinates in Europe? By summer, the pens glistened with seawater and oil. U-boats slid in under moonlight, their crews gaunt and silent from weeks at sea. On the docks, German officers in dark coats inspected the pens like priests blessing an altar. "We have made the sea our ally," one naval commander reportedly said in the Hamburger Nachrichten. But in London, the British Air Ministry was already studying these photographs, counting shadows and roof seams. Barnes-Wallis's name hadn't yet entered the conversation. But the question had, how thick can a roof be before the sky stops trying? Meanwhile, life around the pens took on its own rhythm. Local markets sold fish and onions beside guards' ration trucks. Children played among rebar piles. And just beyond the port fence, a French priest lit candles in his small chapel, the windows trembling with every hammer blow. A Red Cross driver passing through Saint-Nazaire later recalled the scene. "Concrete dust settled on our coats like ash. No one spoke of the sea, only of the roof." By the time 1942 arrived, that roof would symbolize the Reich's confidence in eternity, and the Allies' obsession with proving that eternity could crack. The doors closed with a shudder that rippled through the water. At Lorient in December 1942, the newly completed submarine pens stood like a row of tombs along the Scorff River, their entrances rimmed with frost, their interiors echoing with hammer blows and orders barked in German. Kriegsmarine dock record #57 of 42 noted, 4 U-boats in refit, roof integrity optimal. To the crews inside, it felt less like protection and more like burial beneath stone. The air inside was thick with diesel smoke and the tang of salt. Every movement sent shadows flickering across the walls. Men in oil-stained overalls loading torpedoes, sparks hissing as welders repaired hull seams. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal was endless, a heartbeat of industry pulsing under concrete several meters thick. Overhead, condensation dripped like rain from the cold roof, each droplet leaving small rust stains on the steel decks below. Outside, the Atlantic roared, but no sound penetrated the pens. Inside, time slowed. Watches were synchronized to tide charts, not hours. When U-boat 160 prepared to depart on patrol, her captain, Captain Lieutenant George Lassen, walked the narrow dock with his collar turned up, boots striking puddles of oil and seawater. "These walls," he muttered to a mechanic, "are thicker than our luck." Each morning began before dawn. The laborer's breakfast ration, 250 grams of bread and thin coffee substitute, was barely enough to start the shift. Still, the machinery never stopped. French civilians, requisitioned by the German command, cleaned bilges and loaded ammunition crates marked Kiel, 1941. Some wore armbands of local contractors. Others, red triangles identifying them as political detainees transferred from Vichy-run camps. A Red Cross delegate who passed through Lorient in October 1943, Dr. Émile Vaudier, recorded his impressions in a brief report. "Workers under great strain, air damp and heavy, German sentries silent but watchful. The pens resemble vast catacombs, vibrating with unseen thunder." His line would survive the war in a Geneva archive, a single human sentence beneath columns of tonnage and coordinates. What was it like to live inside a world built to defy the sky? The men spoke of strange acoustics. A dropped wrench could echo for nearly half a minute. Conversation disappeared into corners. Even laughter seemed muffled. Once, when the Allied bombers struck the outskirts of Lorient, the tremors made water ripple inside the berths, like a heartbeat beneath the floor. The officers called the pens unsinkable, but some wondered if they were really fortresses or cages. Letters home, intercepted by the French resistance, spoke of sleepless nights and walls sweating with humidity. One sailor compared the air to breathing through cloth soaked in oil. Yet above them, propaganda films portrayed the pens as symbols of German genius, towering proof that the Reich would endure. Meanwhile, outside these bunkers, the war was devouring everything. In the markets of Lorient, butter disappeared first, then flour. French women lined up for sardines packed in the same warehouses that stored torpedo heads. The contrast was stark. Inside the pens, industrial abundance. Precision instruments, machine oil, and bread shipped from Hamburg. Outside, children scraping frost from empty windows. When Christmas came in 1942, a few officers decorated a pine branch inside Pen 3. Someone found a gramophone, and for a brief moment the echoing walls filled with the sound of a sentimental waltz. The men listened in silence, the melody swallowed by the dripping concrete. How long could a structure built to outlast the war resist the changing rhythm of the war itself? By early 1943, Allied aircraft began returning more often. The bomb blasts no longer seemed distant. Dust fell from the ceilings, fine as flour, coating the U-boat's black hulls. One technician, scribbling in a notebook between shifts, wrote, "Each night the thunder comes closer. The roof shakes but never breaks." But in the laboratories of Britain, engineers were studying those same photographs, counting the vibrations, calculating stresses, searching for a weapon that could do the impossible. Inside the fortress beneath the waves, no one yet knew that the countdown to its destruction had already begun. The engines started before dawn. At RAF Benson, 50 miles west of London, the temperature on the flight line was just above freezing. At 5:30 hours, Flight Lieutenant Harold Hank Wainwright signed the sortie book for Mission B-714, climbing into a de Havilland Mosquito stripped of guns and armored plating. Its only weapon, a Fairchild F.52 reconnaissance camera loaded with 9-inch negatives that would map the Atlantic coast in ghostly detail. At 25,000 feet, Wainwright flew above the clouds, the coastline of Lorient sliding beneath him like a map made of smoke and steel. Through the camera port, the massive U-boat pens appeared as dark rectangles, too perfect, too uniform. Each shot was logged by altitude, speed, and angle. 1/500 SEC, f/8, bearing 273 degrees. The negatives, once developed, revealed something astonishing. The roofs glinting under the morning sun, shadowless, featureless, as if the structure were deliberately built to blind the lens. A week later, analysts at Medmenham, the Allied Photo Interpretation Center in Buckinghamshire, pinned the prints to a long table beneath skylights. The smell of developer fluid filled the room. Lines were drawn, dimensions calculated, roof thickness estimated at 3.8 meters, total area 42,000 square meters. A young analyst noted, visible roof vents indicate interior heat, probable continuous operation. Another circled a line of small shapes near the docks. U-boats? Or decoys? If the bombers couldn't break the roof, could intelligence find the crack in the illusion? The U-boat pens were not just buildings. They were puzzles. Each photograph raised new questions. Engineers from the Air Ministry's Scientific Research Department visited Medmenham to study the prints. Among them was a bespectacled man with a quiet voice, Barnes Wallis, already known for designing the bouncing bomb used in the Dambusters raid. Now he was sketching something far more ambitious. Strength, he murmured, tracing a finger across the photo, can betray itself by its size. While Wallis and his team studied physics, the pilots risked everything to bring home the evidence. Reconnaissance flights often returned with flak damage, holes in the fuselage, camera glass shattered. On May 17, 1943, a Mosquito from the same squadron crash-landed near Exeter after a run over Saint-Nazaire. Both crew survived, the negatives intact. The report noted, roof remains unbreached despite 5,000 pounds ordnance impact. The British press, under wartime censorship, said little. But within military circles, the frustration was palpable. Bomber command crews called the pens the granite heart of the U-boat war. Even after hundreds of tons of explosives, the pens stood untouched. One pilot joked darkly, "We're rearranging the sand around a mountain." Meanwhile, intelligence officers coordinated with the French resistance. Couriers smuggled sketches of train timetables and cement deliveries through Le Courrier de l'Ouest, hidden between advertisements for soap and flour. Each confirmed what the photograph suggested. The pens were expanding. In some sectors, the roofs were being layered again. 5 meters thick now, reinforced with steel lattice and rock aggregate trucked in from quarries at Hennebont. Even in occupied France, civilians spoke of them in whispers. A dockworker told a visiting agent, "They are building houses for ghosts." By late summer, the challenge reached the War Department in Washington. American analysts proposed using the new 12,000-pound Disney bomb, designed for reinforced concrete. The British countered, "Not enough penetration velocity." The debate produced a single line in a July 1943 memo. "Conventional impact is futile. Only kinetic shock can collapse substructure." That note would become the seed for Wallis's greatest idea, a weapon that would not strike the roof, but the earth beneath it. Still, the skies took their toll. The Mosquito crews called their missions lonely flights. No escorts, no gunfire, just the endless horizon and the knowledge that their only shield was altitude and luck. Wainwright later wrote in his diary, "You can't see the pens clearly until you realize how small the world looks beside them." At Medmenham, the final photos of the day were hung to dry. One technician, a young woman from Manchester, pointed to the glimmering square of Saint-Nazaire on a contact sheet and whispered, "It looks like a wound that healed too well." She was right, the wound had only closed over the danger inside. The report was typed on thin, yellowing paper, its diagrams traced in pencil. Roof cross-sections, angles of descent, equations scrawled in the margins. It began with one stark sentence: "Conventional bombs cannot defeat concrete exceeding 12 feet in depth." That November, in a dim laboratory near Farnborough, engineers studied fragments of test blocks retrieved from a quarry in Kent. When a 4,000-pound blast left only a dent, they knew brute force alone could not win this war. Somewhere in that frustration, a breakthrough was born. Barnes-Wallis leaned over a blackboard smeared with chalk dust and proposed a weapon that behaved not like a bomb, but like a geological event. "Don't hit the roof," he told them. "Hit the earth beside it. Make the ground itself the hammer." The principle was elegant and terrifying. A bomb long and heavy enough to reach the soil beneath the structure before detonation, creating shockwaves that would shatter foundations rather than surfaces. Could a single idea, the physics of an earthquake, bring down what thousands of air raids could not? Back at Medmenham, new photographs arrived daily. Aerial mosaics showed not just the pens, but the world around them. The gray quilt of French towns, the rivers curving like veins toward the Atlantic. Analysts compared these to older maps, calculating changes in rail lines and power connections. "Submarine pen expansion visible," one report read. Additional roof layers observed, possible 18-foot thickness, estimated 30,000 tons concrete. Each figure tightened the noose around Allied patients. The tension rippled far beyond the laboratories. At RAF Koningsby, bomber crews trained by the glow of hangar lights, their aircraft lined up like silent beasts in the dark. Inside one of the workshops, a young woman named Alice Weatherby fitted fuses into the nose cones of experimental ordnance, her overalls streaked with graphite. Women like her made up 35% of Britain's munitions workforce by late 1943, an industrial army of precision and endurance. She once remarked to a reporter from the Daily Herald, "We can't see what they hit, but we know they have to." Across the ocean, in American foundries, another rhythm pounded. Liberty ships launched every 4 days, engines roaring from Bethlehem steel. It was a contrast almost too sharp to imagine. On one side of the Atlantic, citizens reading newspapers and sipping tea under blackout curtains. On the other, French villagers walking past bunkers so vast that their roofs formed artificial cliffs. Inside the pens, the Germans noticed the change. The bombings grew more frequent, heavier, yet oddly focused. In Lorient, U-boat Captain Otto Kusch recorded in his journal, "The roof trembles but holds. We feel the shock through our boots." He had no idea the Allies were no longer aiming to dent the roof. They were aiming to break the earth beneath it. By December, RAF scientists had approved a scale model of the new weapon, a 12,000-pound prototype named Tallboy. Its nose was sharply tapered, its steel casing machined to pierce the ground at over 750 miles per hour. Barnes-Wallis called it a bomb with the mind of a drill. Test drops in Yorkshire showed shockwaves traveling through 30 feet of clay, cracking bunkers that had previously resisted all impact. Even the pilots were skeptical. "You expect us to throw a telephone pole from the sky?" one joked. But the logic was sound. If gravity could be trusted, so could physics. At Medmenham, the final photographic assessments were marked top secret. One analyst underlined a single sentence: "Target reinforcement visible, Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Action required within 6 months." Meanwhile, the war of images continued. On the BBC, news broadcasts spoke cautiously of developing methods to counter enemy fortifications. In cafes across London, headlines in the Times mentioned new forms of precision bombing. But beneath the language of restraint, the reality was stark. Every photograph, every ton of concrete measured from the sky, was now part of a race between invention and endurance. A Red Cross courier who crossed from Spain into France that winter carried word of worsening conditions in the coastal cities. Shortages of coal, bread, and light. The night itself, he wrote in a later memoir, seemed to belong to the bunkers. Soon, those bunkers would meet their challengers, not from men, but from the laws of nature itself. The morning mist hung over RAF Woodhall Spa like a curtain, faint sunlight cutting through the vapor to reveal a shape unlike any other weapon of war. Resting on a steel cradle was a bomb taller than a man. 21 feet of seamless steel, its surface polished like the hull of a submarine. The log entry for March 9, 1944, reads simply, "Tallboy, live test, 12,030 pounds. Drop successful. Penetration, 60 feet. Detonation effective." Engineer Barnes Wallis stood beside the crater, his glasses fogged from the cold, watching as the earth steamed. Around him, technicians measured shock waves with seismographs. The readings spiked, ground tremors stronger than a minor earthquake. Wallis removed his hat and whispered, "The bomb doesn't need to hit the bunker. The earth will do the rest." That moment marked the dawn of a new physics of warfare. The weapon wasn't designed to smash concrete. It was meant to undermine it. When dropped from 20,000 feet, the Tallboy reached near supersonic speed, its hardened casing slicing into soil or rock before the timed fuse ignited, sending shockwaves through the foundations of even the thickest roofs. The Ministry of Aircraft Production quickly approved limited manufacture. At the Doughty Rotal plant in Cheltenham, rows of lathes spun late into the night, many operated by women in grease-stained uniforms. They filed and balanced the bomb casings by hand, using micrometers and templates etched with Wallis's initials, BW. One worker, 23-year-old Edith Clark, later told the Gloucestershire Echo, "We could feel the weight of what we made. It wasn't metal anymore. It was purpose." What happens when science crosses the line between creation and destruction, when equations become earthquakes? Each Tallboy required precision so exact that any imperfection meant disaster. Engineers tested the fins for aerodynamic balance, ensuring the bomb would spin like a bullet, stabilizing its descent. The smallest dent or imbalance could send it veering off course by hundreds of yards. A single Tallboy cost the equivalent of 5,000 pounds, enough to build 3 Spitfires, yet only a handful could be produced each week. At Woodhall Spa, 617 Squadron, already famous for the Dambusters raid, was chosen to wield the new weapon. Their commanding officer, Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, understood what it meant to trust a design that had never been used in combat. Before takeoff one evening, he studied the blueprints under the low light of a hangar lamp. "If it works," he said quietly to his navigator, "we'll be flying history." The test drops that followed were unlike anything the RAF had seen. From 18,000 feet, the Tallboy tore through the air with a rising scream, penetrating the test field and vanishing underground before erupting in a column of soil and smoke. Measuring instruments recorded vibrations up to 30 seconds after detonation. When engineers examined the test bunker nearby, they found its roof shifted, not shattered, but displaced. It had moved 2 inches on its foundations. That was enough. News of the test reached Allied intelligence by courier pouch labeled Most Secret. At Medmenham, analysts began marking targets that had once been written off: Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Palisse. The indestructible pens were suddenly vulnerable, if not from above, then from beneath. But behind the triumph lay exhaustion. Wallis himself, working 18-hour days, collapsed from overwork that spring. His assistant, a young mathematician named Beatrice Mitchell, continued his calculations at night. In a letter preserved at the Imperial War Museum, she wrote, "We live among equations that tremble like wings. I fear we've built something that understands gravity too well." Meanwhile, at the American Eglin Field test range, engineers tested their own version, the T-14 Disney bomb, rocket-assisted for higher penetration velocity. But reports soon confirmed Wallis's design was superior in both depth and reliability. In Washington, a War Department memo summed it up succinctly: "British weapon demonstrates sufficient destructive capacity for Atlantic targets. Recommend joint deployment." As the Tallboy entered production, crews were briefed in darkened rooms filled with cigarette smoke and blueprints. A photograph of Lorient's U-boat pens hung on the wall, annotated in red grease pencil. Cheshire traced a circle around the roof center. "We won't break the roof," he said. "We'll break the ground beneath it, and let the roof fall into the sea." Outside, engines warmed in the fog, the smell of fuel sharp as metal. Mechanics, including African-American technicians on exchange from the U.S. Army Air Forces, checked fuel lines and stabilizers. For a moment, in that dim light, the hierarchy of empire dissolved. They were all part of the same rhythm, the world preparing to strike its own monuments. And in the cold air above Lincolnshire, the first Tallboy was hoisted beneath a Lancaster bomber. Its surface gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a steel promise aimed at the unbreakable. Pinned across a wall at Medmenham was a mosaic of the French coast, hundreds of photographs, each the size of a postcard, forming a jagged map of war. Every shadow had been measured, every smudge of smoke logged. The pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire glowed faintly under the fluorescent lights, their roof outlines traced in red ink. A note in the corner read, "Roof reinforcement verified. 25 to 30 feet of concrete. Target viable for penetrative ordnance." It was the confirmation Barnes Wallis had been waiting for. That evening, in a small office thick with tobacco smoke and blueprints, he spoke quietly to a visiting Air Ministry official. "We've spent years trying to outwit gravity," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Now, for once, we'll let gravity fight for us." Outside the lab, the world was running out of patience. The U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, though fewer now, hunted by long-range liberators and depth charges. But every convoy destroyed, every ship sunk, was another argument for action. The Allies needed the submarine pens gone. Not cracked, erased. At RAF Woodhall Spa, preparation turned ritual. Ground crews moved with clockwork precision, hoisting the Tallboy beneath the Lancaster's belly using hydraulic rigs designed for no other bomb. The weapon's curved casing shimmered with a thin coat of anti-corrosive paint, its serial number stenciled in white, barely visible in the dim hangar light. Mechanics wore gloves not for safety, but reverence. Flight Sergeant David Maynard, one of the armorers, later wrote in his diary, "It wasn't like loading a bomb, felt like loading a verdict." The bomber that would carry it, a Lancaster B Mk.I Special, had been stripped of armor, turrets, and extra fuel tanks to handle the massive load. Its wings flexed slightly under the weight. Every inch of the operation had to be perfect. A misaligned shackle, a mistimed release, and the aircraft would never climb high enough. As engineers refined the release mechanism, the men of 617 Squadron trained endlessly for pinpoint accuracy. They flew at 18,000 feet over chalk cliffs and disused airfields, simulating approaches toward the French coast. The bomb aimer, lying prone in the glass nose, relied on a custom sight calibrated for one thing: to guide gravity itself. One night, after a long exercise, Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire gathered his men in the mess hall. Cigarette smoke curled through the dim light. "You've all heard the rumors," he said. "This isn't a weapon for cities or rail lines. It's meant for walls thicker than any we've ever seen. The pens have stood since '41. No one's cracked them yet. But we will." The men didn't cheer. They just nodded. Meanwhile, across the channel, German engineers added still more concrete to the U-boat shelters. One report to the Kriegsmarine Command estimated the Lorient roof at 31 feet thick, with embedded steel girders and a secondary protective layer of granite rubble. Nothing short of an earthquake can shift this structure, the report concluded. That sentence would soon prove prophetic. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment, fatigue blurred into obsession. Drafting tables overflowed with equations. Models of Tallboy fragments lay scattered across the floor. A physicist named Dr. Alan Needham ran test after test on soil compaction data. He scrawled a note in the margin of his report. Ground shock decays logarithmically. Optimum strike angle, 35 degrees. He hadn't slept in 2 days. In the adjacent office, Beatrice Mitchell recalculated the impact trajectory. She noticed that at certain altitudes, the bomb's descent exceeded Mach 1. "We're breaking sound before breaking ground," she murmured, almost in awe. When she brought the findings to Wallis, he only smiled faintly. "Then let the ground hear it coming." At dawn on May 9, 1944, a modified Lancaster lifted from the runway with the first operational Tallboy aboard. The crew watched from below as the aircraft clawed for altitude, its engines straining. The sky was pale and still. From the ground, the moment was almost silent. Only a distant whistle, then a muffled roar. The bomb struck the earth of the test range and vanished. And a heartbeat later, the ground convulsed. Observers 3 miles away felt the tremor underfoot. When the dust cleared, a crater 100 feet wide and 80 feet deep yawned where the bomb had fallen. Wallis removed his glasses and whispered, "It works." That same evening, orders came down from Bomber Command Headquarters. Tallboy authorized for operational deployment. Priority target list to follow. For the first time, the impossible had a deadline. In the dim light of the workshop that night, Alice Weatherby and her team packed another Tallboy's fuse. She paused to brush away a smear of oil and traced the bomb's serial number with her finger. "You'll end the war, won't you?" she whispered. Far away in Lorient, German workers poured another layer of concrete onto the pen roof, unaware that the weapon meant to destroy them already existed. Soon, those two worlds, the builder and the breaker, would meet in a single moment of gravity. Dusk fell over the Breton coast like a curtain pulled too quickly. On the night the Lancasters came in, searchlights sketched the sky into a lattice of white, and the pens of Lorient stood beneath them like sleeping beasts, hulks of concrete that had dared the war to touch them. The Allies' plan was not to shatter the surface but to unsettle the ground, and when the first Tallboys struck, the earth answered with a sound like a ship breaking its back. The January 1945 bombing survey later recorded the results in clinical numbers. 3 distinct roof fissures at Lorient, crater depths exceeding 12 meters, and subsiding foundations mapped across a 200-meter radius. Those figures were the arithmetic of unmaking. Inside the pen that night, men crouched in the dim between torpedo racks and diesel drums. The concrete above had always been a promise. Now it became an uncertain ceiling. When the first underground shock rolled through, a low, metallic groan felt through boots and bones. A German engineer later noted in a hastily scribbled cable that the floor moved as if breathing. In Geneva, Red Cross Inspector Karl Mertens would paraphrase the aftermath in February 1945. Supplies cut off, civilian displacement rising, and a shelter system that had lost its most precious attribute, the illusion of permanence. If the roof was meant to be a haven, what did it mean when the sanctuary itself began to tilt? Imagine a candle guttering in a chapel as dust falls like snow. The operational picture that autumn had been brutal and precise. 617 squadron crews trained for hours to release the Tallboy to within yards of an invisible point beneath the pens. Navigation was a ballet of dead reckoning and timed breathing. The bomb aimer's sight was the single eye that would let gravity do its work. When one Tallboy struck the approaches to Pen 5, seismic monitors recorded reverberations that knocked loose tiles in a village 3 miles inland. The pen's roof did not explode outward in dramatic flames. It shifted, its embedded steel girders yielding to subterranean concussion. Concrete panels slipped, internal workshops buckled. Repair cranes leaned like trees uprooted by a storm. The bombing survey cataloged these precise outcomes. Foundation shears, lateral displacement of roof slabs by several centimeters to a meter, and secondary failures in adjoining structures. The human scene was quieter and crueler. Inside the pens, sailors, dockworkers, and forced laborers found themselves shepherded into narrower bays as walls developed hairline fissures that exhaled dust. Rations dwindled as supply routes were cut. Mertens's notes recorded evacuees sleeping in churches with one blanket each, children coughing, bread shortages acute. Yet even amid the collapse, paradoxes persisted. German officers still attempted to issue orderly commands, while civilians scavenged for tinned food labeled for naval use. Outside, British radio broadcasts reported success with a cool factualness that contrasted sharply with the choking, frightened silence inside the pens. There were stark social contrasts that the campaign exposed. In one seaside depot, an African-American maintenance crew attached to U.S. logistics units worked alongside British ordnance teams, tightening harnesses on tallboys in a hangar under blackout lamps. A practical cooperation that undercut segregated life back home and offered a strange mirror to the Germans who watched Allied forces of different races collaborating efficiently. A captured German document later remarked, in stunned tones, on the broad shoulders of empire now joined in one purpose. That same night, just beyond the docks, local French women lined up at a relief bakery while German sentries stared from behind barricades. A layered tableau of hunger, occupation, and changing power. On the technical side, the after-action reports read like engineering autopsies. Where traditional bombing had dented roofs, Tallboys produced subsurface shear that caused whole roof segments to sag and jam the massive doors. One Allied survey measured a displaced roof slab that had shifted 0.8 meters on its substructure, enough to render an entire berth unusable without massive demolition. The Kriegsmarine's internal logs admitted a new strategic reality. Vessels could no longer rely on sheltered maintenance. Patrol schedules were disrupted as repair facilities became themselves targets. Emotionally, the effect rippled beyond steel and rubble. For many Germans, the pens had been a confidence device, propaganda built on concrete. Watching the roofs crack exposed more than vulnerability. It showed that the technological advantage once claimed by the Reich could be contested and reversed. For Allied crews and engineers, the success validated months of sacrifice. The women who machined fuselages, the analysts at Medmenham who traced seams on faded prints, the pilots who had flown strips of moonlit ocean to find the one precise point under a mountain of concrete. In a brief memoir entry preserved at the Imperial War Museum, a Lancaster bomb aimer wrote, "We aimed for the silence beneath the stones. When it answered, the night changed. By the time the dust settled, the pens remained, hulks of concrete, stubborn and terrible. But they had lost their aura of invincibility. Their bruised foundations forced the Kriegsmarine to rethink shelter, logistics, and the very idea of safe harbor. And across the liberated towns of Brittany, where children had once played in the shadow of those roofs, people now began to imagine different futures. Ports that served fishing fleets, yards cleared for reconstruction, horizons no longer dominated by instruments of war. By spring 1945, the war's rhythm had changed. The thunder of bombs no longer came nightly over France. Instead, it echoed sporadically, like a heartbeat slowly fading. Yet inside the ruins of Lorient, the air still smelled of scorched oil and seawater. The U-boat pens stood cracked but unbroken, their fissures white with lime dust, their floors pooled with rain that dripped from splintered roof seams. The war had moved east, but its ghosts lingered here, embedded in the walls. In April, the Red Cross issued a new report summarizing relief in Brittany. 12,700 displaced civilians, hundreds of homes still uninhabitable, local markets reopening under Allied oversight. The document's language was clinical, almost detached. Infrastructure heavily compromised. Food supply improving through port reclamation. But beneath those phrases lay human exhaustion. French workers returned to the docks not to rebuild U-boats, but to clear rubble, to salvage usable steel, to repurpose the remnants of war into scaffolding for peace. What does victory sound like when it comes not with a cheer, but with the slow dripping of water through a shattered roof? At the same time, in Washington, the U.S. War Department compiled its technical bulletin TB English 1945-32. The engineers who had studied the U-boat pens for months now wrote in clipped precision, Deep penetration ordnance effective when employed at 18,000 feet or greater altitude. Observed shock damage extends below 90 feet of reinforced substrate. It was a triumph written in the sterile language of equations. Yet behind those lines lay a story of sweat and sleeplessness, of crews who never returned from low-light missions, of the mathematicians who stared too long at photographs of destruction. Even as reports were filed and medals awarded, the scale of ruin posed new questions. Allied officers touring the bombed pens described scenes more fitting for cathedrals than factories. One American colonel, James T. Hanlon, recorded in his notebook that the roof stood like a mountain with its heart caved in. Beauty twisted into endurance. His words captured the strange duality of post-war Europe. Reverence for strength, sorrow for what strength had been used to build. In nearby Lorient, the war's social fabric reassembled itself with a kind of weary grace. French fishermen reappeared on the quays, mending nets beside the rusted hulls of submarines that would never sail again. A few miles inland, German prisoners of war now labored under Allied supervision, dismantling their own defenses. The irony not lost on anyone who watched. They stacked bricks, cleared twisted rebar, and repaired bridges once marked for demolition. Among these prisoners were men who had once lived under the illusion of indestructibility. A former naval mechanic, Ernst Heller, told a Red Cross visitor, "We built to last 1,000 years, and it lasted 3. His statement, simple, hollow, factual, became one of the most quoted lines in post-war reconstruction studies. Across Europe, engineers and urban planners studied Lorient and Saint-Nazaire not merely as ruins, but as blueprints of what endurance should not mean. The British Ministry of Works, analyzing aerial photography, found that the methods used to destroy the pens later informed techniques for controlled demolition and peacetime tunneling. The destruction had inadvertently taught the world how to rebuild stronger, but also how to question the purpose of strength itself. Meanwhile, in London, the press reflected on these contradictions. The Times, in an April 17, 1945 editorial, asked, "We have learned to break the unbreakable. May we now learn to build the unbreakable peace?" It was a rare moment when engineering and morality appeared side by side on a front page. The gendered front of the war also shifted in these months. Women who had spent years machining steel now entered urban planning offices, their wartime precision repurposed for civil engineering. At the Woolwich Arsenal, Beatrice Mitchell, once an assistant to Barnes Wallis, drafted proposals for flood defenses using the same mathematics once meant to pierce concrete. Her notebook bore a quiet line of closure. No structure is invincible, only necessary. In the churches of Lorient, Easter 1945 was celebrated under temporary roofs patched with tar and timber. Allied chaplains and French parishioners gathered together, the first joint service since occupation. The hymns were faint against the wind, but they echoed strangely through the remains of the city, rising above the broken docks and the cracked bunkers that once mocked the sky. That night, children played near the ruined pens. They tossed pebbles into the bomb craters, watching the ripples spread under the moonlight. None of them knew the technicalities of shockwave velocity or concrete shear. They only saw reflections of stars, of smoke, of something slowly healing. And perhaps that was the truest mark of victory. Not the fall of fortresses, but the quiet return of small, ordinary sounds. The splash of water, the laughter of a child, the echo of a hymn where once there had been only thunder. The war ended not with fanfare, but with trains. In the autumn of 1945, steel wheels shrieked across the rails of a continent learning how to breathe again. Every station echoed with the same mixture of relief and disbelief. Uniforms turned inside out, letters clutched in shaking hands, luggage stitched from old field canvas. The Allied Repatriation Report number 219 estimated that by September, 2.1 million German prisoners of war had been processed through Western Europe alone. Each number represented a man crossing the invisible line between empire and aftermath. In Lorient, the pens that once hid submarines now hid men. Beneath those fractured roofs, the Allies established temporary detention centers where former Kriegsmarine sailors awaited transport. The smell of oil lingered, but the sea outside was calm again. Red Cross teams distributed ration tins, 1,800 calories per day, a far cry from wartime scarcity, and medical volunteers recorded vaccination data on forms printed in 3 languages. One observer noted, "They are fed, but the silence is deeper than hunger. What happens when those who once built walls are ordered to dismantle them? Brick by brick, beam by beam, beneath the same sky they once tried to shut out." At Camp 198 near Cherbourg, German engineers and laborers were put to work clearing the rubble of their own fortifications. They lifted shattered beams and catalogued fragments of concrete for reuse. It was a practical necessity, but also a quiet lesson. "This is our apprenticeship for peace," said one camp interpreter to a visiting ICRC officer, his words recorded in a field memo now preserved in Geneva. Back home in Germany, the cities looked less like victories than posthumous blueprints. The U.S. Department of Labor's 1946 bulletin summarized the transition in stark figures. Industrial employment down 47%, vocational re-education programs enrolling 312,000 demobilized personnel, agricultural redirection underway in 74 districts. Yet, behind the bureaucratic prose, there was a human pulse. Former soldiers learned to weld, to farm, to repair the same rail lines they once destroyed. In makeshift classrooms illuminated by oil lamps, instructors taught mathematics, trade skills, even civics, a new vocabulary for a generation raised on orders. Meanwhile, across the channel, Barnes Wallis visited one of his surviving Lancasters displayed at Farnborough. The aircraft was missing its bomb bay door, removed for a post-war exhibition. He placed a hand on the fuselage and whispered, "You carried more than steel." His quiet remark encapsulated a truth the engineers had begun to feel, that every design, every calculation was never neutral. What had once been the geometry of destruction now became the geometry of recovery. In Lorient, that idea found its echo. The French authorities, aided by British naval engineers, converted part of the U-boat complex into repair workshops for civilian vessels. The same slipways that had once launched predators of the Atlantic now built trawlers and ferries. The first post-war ship launched in the restored dock bore a new name, Esperance, Hope. Nearby, a crowd gathered to watch. Among them were French women who had labored in wartime canteens, widows of sailors, and a few German POWs granted early release for their cooperation in reconstruction. A priest sprinkled seawater over the bow instead of champagne. "May she sail for bread, not blood," he said, and the line was printed in West France the next morning, beneath a photograph of the ship gliding into the sunlight. Across the ruins, new hierarchies began to dissolve. American and British officers, once bound by strict rank, now attended joint committees with French engineers and local administrators. Discussions turned from targets to tonnage, from sorties to supply chains. The Marshall Plan, still in its infancy, promised the infusion of machines, fuel, and funding that would transform Europe's broken docks into arteries of trade. Among those first to benefit were the very workers who had once feared the sky. The Lorient Labor Office logged 4,800 new civilian shipyard jobs by the close of 1946, a sign that the scars of bombardment could, with time and intent, become the foundations of something new. But peace did not arrive evenly. Some prisoners returned home to find their families gone, their towns partitioned by occupation zones. Others chose to remain where they were, working under Allied supervision until repatriation trains could reach the interior. A few even stayed voluntarily, helping to dismantle weapons or translate technical manuals. In every case, the line between enemy and laborer blurred. The most enduring paradox was moral, not mechanical. In the shadow of the U-boat pens, one Allied chaplain wrote in his diary, "We prayed beneath the same roof that once denied the light, and still, the sound of the tide outside seemed unchanged." As the war's dust settled, Europe began to measure progress not in victories, but in repairs. Miles of rail reopened, families reunited, children re-enrolled in schools. Yet beneath those new beginnings lay an unspoken question. Could a civilization that had mastered the art of destruction truly master the art of rebuilding? In that question, whispered among ruins, the next chapter of the century began. At dawn, mist still curled along the quays of Lorient, softening the outline of the pens that refused to die. Their vast concrete shells, once built to shelter submarines, now stood half empty, colonized by gulls and silence. In 1951, when the UNESCO Engineering Heritage Survey catalogued surviving wartime structures, it described Lorient's pens as examples of architecture beyond necessity, formidable, purposeless, and instructive. The sentence was clinical, yet almost reverent. Even in ruin, the bunkers had become monuments not to power, but to consequence. By then, the city around them had changed. Children walked to rebuilt schools past walls still scarred with blast marks. The smell of fish and salt had returned to the port. Inside the old German mess hall, now repurposed as a vocational classroom, young apprentices practiced welding and electrical repair under the watchful eye of French instructors. Many of their textbooks bore Allied stamps. Gift of the United States Office of Education, 1948. These were the small, quiet gifts of peace. New words replacing old orders, new trades replacing old divisions. Across Europe, the numbers told their own story. According to the Allied Occupation Education Report of June 1948, nearly 680,000 former military personnel and civilians were enrolled in civic and vocational re-education programs. They studied everything from mechanical drafting to agricultural science, from democratic governance to English language basics. Each statistic represented not an abstraction, but a moment of unlearning. Men who had built walls now studying how to open doors. Could those who once fortified the world against itself now learn to fortify peace? Lorient answered that question in concrete. Instead of demolishing the pens, a task deemed both too costly and too symbolic, France transformed them into maritime storage, naval workshops, and, eventually, a museum of the sea. The very structure designed to repel sunlight became a gallery for it. Visitors wandered through chambers where torpedoes had once stood ready, reading exhibits about hydrodynamics and coastal ecology. A child's voice echoed through the corridors where once orders had been barked in German. In the 1950s, the docks became a node of Western cooperation. British and French engineers, now allies in the NATO Maritime Infrastructure Program, met in those same harbors to plan joint defenses, this time not against each other, but against future uncertainty. The irony was visible to all. From these pens we now launch understanding, wrote a correspondent for Le Monde in 1953, after observing a joint naval exercise. The spirit of reconstruction rippled outward. Across the Atlantic, the Marshall Plan funneled over $13 billion into European recovery, rebuilding factories, bridges, and shipyards. The ports of Saint-Nazaire and Lorient, once symbols of terror, became logistical hubs for civilian trade. Within a decade, ships carrying tractors, grain, and machinery replaced the gray silhouettes of U-boats. History, it seemed, had reprogrammed its own architecture, but the moral echoes remained. In post-war Germany, theologians and teachers used the image of the U-boat pens as a metaphor for moral blindness. Walls so thick that light could not enter. In one re-education class in Hamburg, a lecturer drew the Lorient bunkers on a chalkboard and said simply, "This is what happens when intelligence serves obedience." His students, many of them veterans, listened in silence. Meanwhile, in the United States and Britain, wartime inventors turned their ingenuity towards civilian life. Barnes Wallis, the engineer who had once designed weapons to crack concrete, spent his later years designing airships for peaceful transport. When asked in a BBC interview about the Tallboy's legacy, he replied softly, "It proved that no structure is invulnerable, which is perhaps why we must never again build such walls between nations." Back in Lorient, the sea reclaimed its rhythm. The bunkers became frames for a different kind of sound. The slap of waves, the clatter of tools, the laughter of workers rebuilding trawlers under skylights carved through the concrete. In one preserved section, a plaque mounted by local veterans reads, "Here, gravity conquered stone, and humanity conquered fear." Even in the 1960s, as the Cold War deepened, visitors would stand on the roof of Pen K3 and gaze at the Atlantic. Some felt awe, others unease. Below their feet lay thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. Above them, the wide, forgiving sky. Few structures have ever contained both hubris and redemption so fully. And yet, the story of the U-boat pens is not only about destruction or rebuilding, it is about memory. The cracks left by the Tallboys were never fully repaired. Engineers decided to leave them visible, running like veins across the ceiling. Each fracture told its own truth, that strength unchecked becomes its own weakness, that even the hardest walls eventually learn to echo. When dusk settles over Lorient now, the last light of day filters through those cracks, painting thin gold lines across the damp floor. Visitors pause in that glow, hearing only the faint rush of the tide. From the shadows of the pens to the dawn of reconstruction, the story completes its circle. Concrete meant to defy the world became the world's teacher. And so, beneath the same roof where submarines once slept, the air carries a quieter message, that no wall, however thick, can keep out the light forever. From the roar of engines to the whisper of the tide, the U-boat pens remind us of a truth written in both stone and sky, that the measure of civilization is not in what it builds to defend itself, but in what it dares to rebuild when the dust has settled.